Hello everyone, my name's Gail and I was listening to a webinar by Judith Orlaff about empaths and being an empath and empathy and what it is, and I just wanted to share it with you because it was quite interesting, and then you can go off and do your own Googling and research and learn something new. So Dr. Judith Orlaff is a New York Times best-selling author, psychiatrist and leading voice in the fields of medicine, psychiatry, empathy and intuitive development. She has lots of other things as well, but you can look that up for yourself. She's written lots of books and it's all really interesting. Empathy is usually spoken about as more of an abstract concept or something that you show once, whereas she talks about it as a practice that you have to do every day in order to increase your open-heartedness and to increase your healing abilities so you can heal yourself and help heal others. Empathy opens the heart. It's one of the actions that we can take to open our heart and to shift out of an overactive mind. The mind doesn't want to have a lot of empathy because it feels very justified in being right and staying hurt and not wanting to heal. But learning how to shift out of this overactive mind into a state of empathy opens the heart, creates healing inside of the body. It's just all good. So if you're feeling anxious, if you perform an empathic act like really reflecting back on someone else's feelings or being nice and kind to yourself even, the idea is that it will trigger your own healing, and this will extend throughout your body. So yeah, give it a try and see how you feel. To start off with, you need to have an awareness of your own body's energies and where you're at this precise moment. If you're feeling empathy, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you feel like you're overthinking, then you should consciously say to yourself, I'm going to shift now out of my head and into my heart. And you begin to practice self-empathy, showing yourself compassion for whatever's happened that day. Tell yourself that you did a great job in a hard situation, and it's okay that it didn't turn out perfectly. You still did a great job. Or if you've done something that you regret, talk to yourself nicely and say it's fine, because you can go back to the person tomorrow and apologise. It's about self-soothing, and it's bringing this balm of empathy to yourself and your poor overworked mind, and it clears your energy. And if you're still overthinking at 3 a.m. in the morning, this is a good way of shifting your energy so that you can find peace and calm within. So Judith goes on to say that I am a psychiatrist and an empath, and so I have both scientific knowledge and she's also an empath. She knows very well as an empath what empathy overwhelm is, and when too many things are coming at you too fast, there's sight, smell, sounds, people, movement, demands and more sounds. It's just excessive stimulation that is a very painful state, and she often gets into that state when she's in airports, and she finds that's a very vulnerable place for her, and it's not something that you want to be in for too long. So as soon as you feel overloaded, as soon as you can, you need to stop and go into a safe place, a quiet room, close the door, take a breath, close the shades if the light is too intense, and just begin to get quiet so there's no excessive input coming in. And I just think that sounds very, very similar to like autistic overload and other types of neurodivergent overwhelm, and the technique is pretty similar. So whilst you're being quiet and you say nice things to yourself, put your hand on your heart and shift into an empathic state with your own body. Really feel how tired you are and tell yourself it's okay. Now is the time for repair and replenishing. Show yourself empathy and decrease all the stimuli. And that's really important to do for yourself. She goes on to say, I discovered that I was an empath as a little girl, but I didn't have a word for it, so I had no idea what it was. And I was very sensitive. I would feel things coming from people. I would know certain intuitive things. I couldn't go into crowded places or shopping malls. I'd go in feeling fine and walk out feeling exhausted, or with some ache or pain that I didn't have before, and I'd feel anxious. I didn't really understand what was going on. I just knew that those weren't good places for me. And I'd talk to my mother, who was a doctor, and she would say, Dear, just get a thicker skin. You need a thicker skin. You need to be strong in this world. And so she was just left with nothing and felt really alone. She was an only child and she didn't know what to make of being an empath. It wasn't until many years later where through her own work with herself and her own therapy, learning about various aspects of energy in spiritual practice of Taoism, she began to understand things in energetic terms. And then it's much easier to explain what's going on with an empath when you are an empath. And she mentions Star Trek when they started using it with the character Deanna Troi. So it put that idea out into the media, and that really helped her sort of express herself more. She spent a lot of years running from her sensitivities and got involved with adolescence and drugs and everything else in order to shut it off. But she had some really good mentors in her life who taught her a lot of wisdom, and learning that in order for her to be whole, it was not only okay but a beautiful thing for her to incorporate empathy and intuition into her life. I had to do it to be whole. I had to do it to be me, she said. And through the love and support she received, she came into her own and her own power. And she began to own it. And now she lives in a whole different world where empathy is a beautiful thing that she wants to encourage everyone to develop. If you're an empath, if you're listening to this and you want to develop your empathy, wherever you are on the empathy spectrum, either in the centre, where you're happy for other people's happiness or you're sad for other people's sadness, or up on the spectrum to an empath when you're an emotional sponge and you tend to absorb the energy of others or the stress of others. But you need to learn techniques on how to centre yourself so you don't experience empathy fatigue. It's one thing to feel empathy, and it's the other to work with it in a healthy, boundaried way. And she has found that lots of good things come from using empathy in a boundaried way. Liberation comes from it. And you don't have to be an empath to enjoy and learn things in her books. There are different kinds of empathy you might have, or your spouse or your friend might have. Cognitive empathy. that's an empathy more that comes to the mind, where you say something like, I'm sorry that happened to you, or I'm with you with that. Not so much the heart. That would be more of an emotional empath or emotional empathy. But some people will just have cognitive empathy, and that's okay. And if you want to develop it, you can. It's about finding the type of empathy that most moves you and makes you feel whole. Empathy is a very alive force inside your body, and once you begin to activate it, and you begin to learn and know it as an energy that has healing properties. So there are 4 types of empath. The cognitive empath, the emotional empath, the intuitive empath, and the spiritual empath. You can have more than one. Apparently, cognitive empathy is easier than the others. It doesn't demand as much from you in terms of being boundaried. So, cognitive empathy is where you can be with someone with your mind, and it stays in your mind. Many analytic people have cognitive empathy. Engineers, attorneys, people who are brilliant with their minds, they love cognitive empathy. It makes them feel good about themselves, helps them communicate with other people. The only problem with cognitive empathy is, if you're listening to your spouse, for example, talking about some emotional event that happened, the cognitive empath might come in and offer a solution too quickly. And that's a problem because it cuts off the experience of the person expressing what they're going through. So it's best just to wait for a while and allow the person to express their feelings and maybe validate their feelings first before trying to offer a solution. So don't be offering solutions whilst the person's still crying, for example. The emotional empathic style is when you relate to someone emotionally. They share something that's going on in their life and your heart opens up to them and your body starts getting closer to them and you're gushing with warm, loving feelings for them. But the downside of that is that you also may be absorbing their pain, which may be coming in with that beautiful openness that you're showing them. But the primary mode of emotional empathy is through the heart. And it's through emotions, and the downside is emotional overload. And so you need to learn to set boundaries and need to set time limits. And only listen to one subject at a time, because otherwise it becomes too overwhelming. If you start listening to people talk about everything that's bothering them, it gets too much and you'll never be able to communicate with them. And I think I can relate to having that. I have had situations where I've felt like this gushing of empathy and my body did get closer to the person, which is really rare for me because I don't like personal space being invaded. But I did suddenly feel like I wanted to hug them. I managed to restrain myself, but yeah, I have felt that before, but it's not very often that I feel that. Yeah, I would say that kind of empathy catches me off guard sometimes. Yeah, I don't actually like it very much. The next kind of empathy is intuitive empathy, where you intuitively relate to people. You sense your gut feeling, like a ha-ha moment, or knowing, or you get information about people, like clairvoyancy, intuitive information. But the downside is intuitive overload. So you need to have that inner dialogue with yourself and say, please slow down. It's all a bit fast. You can open up about yourself too much too quickly and cause both you and the person listening to be overwhelmed. I do that in therapy quite a lot. I just blurt out everything and it's bad. The fourth style is the spiritual empathy, which is seeing the best in people, their connection to the heart, and what's beautiful in giving and service. A lot of the clergy are spiritual empaths. And it's just more of a spiritually orientated lens through which to see the world. And she goes to put them in order. Intuitive empathy is probably quite easy. And spiritual empathy maybe those ones are really hard. And then emotional empathy is number 2, and cognitive empathy is probably number 4. So she's kind of put it as intuitive, spiritual, emotional, and then cognitive. And I'm assuming that intuitive is the harder one. And it's important to know the styles that your family and your friends have so that you can know how to interrelate with them. Yeah, and I've never done that. I've never thought about the type of empathy that other people have, and it has caused problems with me relating with them. The risk with empathy is getting ill because you're acting kind of like a martyr, and you're giving too much energy and you become depleted and you can become ill. And you might think that this is just the price you pay for loving somebody, but that isn't actually healthy. It's not true. You should be compassionate and empathetic without sacrificing your own health. It's very important to keep those boundaries in place. It's important to be able to say no. You know, you are allowed to say, I wish I could do this, but I really can't because I'm too tired and I need to go to bed. You're allowed to say, you're asking way too much of me. Yeah, you're allowed to set limits. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. But empaths typically are afraid of disappointing people. And as soon as they sense that they've disappointed someone just slightly, they open back up and give too much of themselves away again. And, you know, it's part of being an adult to grow up and realise that you're going to disappoint people and that you've got to set boundaries for yourself. So it's really important to get in the habit of saying no. I like saying no. No's my favourite word. I sometimes say no before the other person's finished their sentence. Empathy isn't about saying yes to everything. It's about saying yes when it feels right. Empathy can be a joyful experience and can feel good. It's not meant to be a burden. It's meant to be a healing force that comes through you to help others and also help yourself. But if you get it wrong and you misuse it, or you allow someone else to misuse you, then it becomes detrimental. So when you set these boundaries, it's important that you feel good about those boundaries. Making sure you get a good night's sleep is really important because it replenishes you. And it's okay to have bad days when you don't feel any empathy at all and you just close yourself off. You know, that's allowed. You don't have to be, You don't have to be empathetic every day. And then you get the other end of the spectrum, where people have no empathy at all, ever. They have empathy deficient disorders. And there's a chapter in her book about them. And you need to know about them, because they are the narcissist, the sociopath, and the psychopath. And you have to know the signs and symptoms of who these people are, so you can identify them right away and not get involved with them, no matter how much they love bomb you. These types of people send out incredible energy of love all the time, which is crazily confusing to people because they have no idea. People that have been starved of love, and they feel this love bombing, and then they feel connected. But these people have no capacity for empathy. And you can end up just feeling totally destroyed by falling in love with a narcissist or a sociopath. A sociopath is somebody who basically doesn't obey the laws and is always scheming and trying to get you involved with schemes and stealing people's money and not caring and having no conscience because they have no empathy. The narcissist who seduces you into a relationship, and then the minute you're hooked, they become cold, withholding and punishing, and they start gaslighting you and they make you think you're crazy. If you have empathy, you just want to try and understand them. But what happens is you start blaming yourself and start thinking that it's your fault and that you're lacking something, and then your self-esteem goes down. These are very toxic people to get involved with. So people can have like narcissistic traits, but they can go to therapy and they can get help. And if they don't blame you with all their problems, then there's hope for them. You know, they can improve and they can increase their empathy levels. But the other kind of narcissist blames you, wants you to go into therapy, wants you to take medication. You're the problem. And if you have got involved with someone like that, you need a strategy with how to deal with them and how to get out of that situation. Obviously, that's really difficult if your boss or your employer happens to be narcissistic. And really, the only solution is to get a different job. And you'll notice these people because of the things that they say. You're so sensitive. Why don't you try and get stronger? You're crazy. Why don't you change the way you're thinking? You're stupid. Yeah, and we try and justify their words as empaths. We try and say, oh, maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe they just said it wrong. It's a very slippery and dangerous path to find yourself on. Then you get the middle of the road people on the middle of the spectrum. That's everyday empathy that humans have. So these people aren't necessarily empaths, but they are still human. And they will say things like, oh, I'm so sorry that you hurt yourself. And they just are the type of people that want to give you a little love if something's happened. And they want to feel happy along with you when you feel happy. My happiness is your happiness. And they're nice people to get to know. They're fine, but they just aren't very high up on the empathy spectrum. And if you were in a relationship with someone like that and they were willing to go to therapy, you can actually work on any issues you have with them, and that will be fine, and they might increase their empathy levels. But if people aren't willing to go to therapy, I would be very suspicious. You don't have to have empathy if you're not drawn to it. As long as your relationships are good, stay where you are. You don't have to go all the way to the top of the spectrum of empathy. You can just improve slightly and that's enough for you. There are no rules with this. It's just a beautiful healing force. And you just choose what suits your body and your being. And then that's it. So in her book, she talks about trauma, because trauma can glaze over the empathy. It's important to heal through trauma-informed techniques. Because sometimes when you've had a trauma, you completely shut down, close up, and you need to learn to reconnect your empathy. But it is possible. And how empathetic you are, apparently, has been shown to have a genetic link and can be passed on in the generations. So it's not only temperament and it's not only environment, it can also be hereditary. And then she talks about resentments and how that kind of gets in the way. It's counterintuitive. If you're carrying a lot of resentments for a lot of years, you're going to be very heavy and weighed down. You're not going to be clear and free in the moment to enjoy empathy. A great way to release resentment is to attempt to have empathy for the person who did the harm. So you don't have to have empathy for the act they committed, whatever they did. You don't have to forgive that unless you want to. But instead have empathy and forgive the suffering and the crippling that's within them that would cause them to do such a thing. And that might be quite a stretch for you, but it's good to stretch out of your mind and into your heart. You might want to say, that's ridiculous. You don't want to have empathy for them ever. But if you can stretch yourself, then it has healing properties for you. And you stop thinking about them and you release them energetically. And then you feel lighter and freer and happier. And it's good practice, even if you don't believe it 100%, to just start saying the words, I forgive you for being so wounded and so hurt that you did these things to me. And when you'll keep saying it over and over again, and you'll experience a kind of liberation. So it's just amazingly healing for you to do that. It's a two-way street. There's you and then there's the resentment. The resentment isn't some inner object, it's a very alive being that connected to you, in the sense that it is an energy that has grown over the years, and it so has a certain resonance. And so in an odd way, the resentment, has to be ready to release you. It's liked being attached to you. It might not want to let go. So you could try asking the resentment to please go away on its own and let go of you. Because the resentments only want you if you're suffering. Resentments aren't interested in people who are awake and compassionate and empathetic. So just try that and see how it makes you feel. Because resentments cause a lot of problems in terms of energetic balance, health and emotional well-being. And she goes on to talk about a boyfriend. She was so in love with him. He was my first experience with love, and he essentially, after 2 years of professing love, of acting love, he dumped me for a cheerleader at school, and without any words, and never gave me any explanation, no closure, nothing. I had no idea what had happened. I was just walking down the street and I saw them making out in a car. Young girls tend to be very sensitive, and I was just stricken by this, and I was resentful for many, 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 many years, and it hurt, and I was resentful of him. And then at a certain point, maybe when I was 30, he contacted me and said, can we get together and talk? Because he never talked to me about this. And I said, sure. And we went to the Rose Cafe in Venice, and he said it was the worst mistake in his life to have broken up with me. In his life, he'd become a heroin addict, and all these things happened to him, and he wanted to fire up our relationship again in some way. And speaking to him, which was never going to happen because I could never trust him. I would never trust anyone again who treated me in that way, but I had the resentment. But then suddenly, when I heard his backstory and I got the bigger picture, I asked him, why did you break up with me? What happened? And he said, I just wanted to be popular and you weren't popular. I have more, in retrospect, understanding of it now. It might sound like a little example, but to me, it has really shaped my life because it made me so afraid to get in relationships again, as I felt so hurt. And I found empathy for him in that conversation, and any attachment that I had to the hurt, it just drifted off. And we reached a closure. Self-empathy is attuning with self. Compassion is showing compassion for the self. It's different. The attuning is to become one with. It's like a musical instrument. You become one with yourself. And when you're showing empathy, it resonates. So it's a bit of a different posture than I'm going to show myself some compassion. My hand will come here. It becomes more from the outside as opposed to attuning with the self. A lot of people are afraid of empathy and they criticize empathy. They say it's not as safe as compassion. With compassion, you don't get burnout, you don't get drained. But what they don't consider is that with empathy, you have to learn self-care tools. You have to learn how to set boundaries. You have to learn how to not merge with people when it's not appropriate and to take on their issues. You have to learn to work with empathy, so it's very different to having compassion. But they are both part of the picture. Empathy and compassion work quite well together. And she goes on to explain empathically attuning to yourself in more detail. Becoming one with. Imagine you have a vibration or a vibratory instrument inside of you and you're trying to mesh with that tune, the attunement, the same tone. And so by feeling the same tone as what's going on inside of you, you become one with it. So when I tune into people, for instance, I can feel the tone inside of them and resonate with it as part of my empathy. It's a way of getting on their wavelength so I can feel their experience. Yeah, and I think I've tried to do that with other people, but my perception of what someone's wavelength is usually not what their wavelength is. So I get it wrong quite a lot. So she's learned how to do it, how to become attuned with herself. As an only child, that's how I replenish. I close the door. I be by myself. I cry if necessary, because that's a form of self-empathy, allowing the tears to flow. It's actually very healing to cry. I feel very positive about most forms of crying. I'll go into the fetal position and make noise. I'll go to sleep, and I'll finally go to my meditation cushion, and I'll just say to myself, this was really hard today, and I'm sorry that you had to go through it, but you'll find a way to work through it with this person or whatever the situation is. It will work out. And so that is attuning with the self. It's not just saying positive words. It's about making it all okay within and knowing that you're going to work it all out. Hugging the self. Maybe that's a little bit too simplistic, but it's about being there for you. And then she goes on to say, you might feel uncomfortable just being around a particular person's energy field. You might not even need to have any interaction with them, but just simply by virtue of getting near them, it might not be something that you want to be near. Shielding is helpful in this case. Shielding is noticing when something's off and noticing that you don't want any more of this. I'm not comfortable with this. Visualizing protection of light around yourself, maybe 6 inches from the body, going all around the feet and the legs. And so you're inside this golden egg, basically, of protection, and it stops the negative energy or the uncomfortable energy from coming in. But it allows positivity to come in for some reason. It doesn't keep that out. But if you create this protection shield with that intention, then you can move more easily among different types of energy. Or if you have one particular person that you're thinking of, you can put up with being around them when you have to be around them. So that's a good idea, imagining kind of a shield around your body to protect you from people that you don't like and you don't feel comfortable around. And if there are people that you don't like, instead of connecting to their suffering, send out energy of empathy and love. Instead of taking it in, you can give it out, you can send it. This is healing at a distance, and it can come through your body and through your heart. If you're feeling empathy for all the war-torn regions of the world, let's say, just send out, I feel this empathy and I send it out to you. And believe me, it knows where to go and what it's doing. You don't have to do anything once you've sent it out. It will go to where it's needed and it will go everywhere. This kind of thing, it's not limited by time and space because it's just so powerful. I'm not making this up. This is something that's very true energetically, and it's much more productive to send out to people than to suffer along with them, because you're not helping them, you're just making yourself miserable. And I think that's so powerful, what she said there. Like, there are so many troubles in the world, and there's so much suffering in the world, and there's so many depressing, draining people in the world that kind of want to suck you dry. And, you know, a really good way of dealing with it and not feeling like you're being unkind would be to pray for them, or just send them love and light, and just sit there by yourself and think of nice things to happen to them, and it will go out. It does go out there into the world somehow, into the universe somehow. You know, you don't need to put it in an envelope and send it in the post. Like, it will find its way. And it's very healing for yourself to know that you've done that. Yeah. So that the energy of empathy works in lots of ways, but she goes on to talk about how when somebody is despondent and all of a sudden they have a ray of hope, that's how the energy works. You don't know where that energy you've sent out is going to go. It might just smack someone in the face when they really need it, and suddenly they will feel better. Another example is somebody was bedridden and then all of a sudden they are wanting to go to the bathroom and get out of bed. It can be something as simple as that. You must have faith in this kind of empathetic love that can travel. And set limits to what you hear on the news. Too much negative news is bad for you, so just watch it for a little bit and then stop. She talks about observing, not absorbing. You can observe and get the general picture of what's happening, but to follow it beat by beat, you're going in the belly of that beast, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to go into dark energy like that. You want to keep a respectful distance from it and not get overly interested in all of it, so you're sucked in and it depletes you. It's okay to find out what's happening, but it's better for the rest of the day for you to live in the here and now and do what you can in your own life to develop yourself, and that will in turn help humanity. And she feels very strongly about that, and actually so do I. And then she goes on to talk about the Mother Teresa effect. And what that is, if you watch someone do an empathetic act, it will touch you. If I were to draw your blood at that moment or during that time, your immunity would go up, your stress hormones would go down, and you would have all kinds of positive changes in your blood indices just by virtue of watching someone do an empathic act. So if you can get the opportunity to watch some empathic acts, do it, and it actually physically improves your body. Look at the unconditional love from your animals when they crawl on your lap and they're looking at you. That's what you have to do to yourself. The way they look at you, you have to look at yourself that way. That's why animals are incredible teachers. The whole point of empathy is to be like them. So yeah, be more dog. Be more dog. Watch how your dog lives in the moment and lives in the day and forgives easily and loves you unconditionally, and start practicing what your dog does, and yeah, that's sort of like empathy. Yeah. The word dog is God backwards by no coincidence. I reckon dogs have been sent to Earth as little gods to help humans with living and loving and being better. So yeah, that's the end. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you're inspired to do some Googling and practice your empathic skills. Thank you for listening.